Hello y'all, we are back with our content review video for Historical Period 2 in the APUSH exam. Just like in the last video, I would strongly recommend having the key concept packet or the SED up and available for you. You can get it by Googling, you can use one of the packets you got in class, you can look at our old reading schedules, right? All of those have the key concepts on them. Historical Period 2, just like Historical Period 1, it's weighted a little bit lower than some of the later historical periods. It's supposed to be about 6 to 8% of the exam. You will not see this historical period as the sole topic of the DBQ or SAQ1 or SAQ2, but it is fair game for the multiple choice, SAQ1 or an LEQ prompt, same as previous one. Starting dates. So 1607, of course, is the founding of Jamestown, the beginning of the British North American Empire. 1754 is the beginning of the fighting of the French and Indian War. In my experience, the SAQ and LEQ on this time period frequently will include both historical period 1 and historical period 2 dates. So you might have, for example, an SAQ question that asks you to compare the economies of New France and New Spain from 1600, HP1 date, through 1754, HP2 date. So for that reason, I think it's really good to think of these two historical periods as interconnected. In the last video, we already talked about a couple of things that actually fall time period-wise in this unit, like the Pueblo Revolt. Okay, so Historical Period 2 asks you to do a lot of comparison and contrast, typically. And the first thing that you might be asked to compare are the major colonial empires. So we kind of introduced this in Historical Period 1, but we're going to spend a bit more time with them now. If you take a look at this map, you can see roughly where there was settlement in 1650. That's pretty early. All of the things that are colored in green, that represents New Spain. All of the orange represents New France. The British colonies are in blue. You can see them still split here because this is before we took New York. And in between them, the Dutch colonies are in red. That's what's usually called New Netherlands. So comparing these empires, this chart has all of the four major empires that you need to know a little bit about. In that left-hand column are the empires. They're in order from top to bottom based on when they were founded. And then across the top are topics that you might be asked to compare. So first, goals of the empire. You can see that I've got this kind of split into two, economic goals and imperial goals. Those are terms the College Board uses. I'm going to talk about both of these two columns kind of together because I think they're intertwined and most of these things you could use to talk about either. So first, starting up at the top with New Spain. The famous slogan for New Spain's founding is that it was founded for God, gold, and glory, right? The three G's. So God, in this case, is the desire to spread Catholicism and to make the Catholic Church more powerful. Notice that I specifically said Catholicism, not just Christianity. That's a very important distinction for the Spanish. In the middle of the Counter-Reformation, they're not just trying to spread Christianity broadly, like any type. They are specifically trying to spread Catholicism as sponsored by the Spanish crown. Past rubrics from SAQs on this topic have allowed students to earn evidence points if they wrote Catholicism, but not if they just wrote oh, the Spanish are trying to spread Christianity. And the same has been true for questions about New France. So you do want to be aware of that distinction. Again, specifically France and Spain Catholic. Back to the God, gold, and glory. So the gold stands in generally for the Spanish desire to make money from their colonies. They also did literally hope to actually find gold. They don't wind up finding much, but the Spanish colonies, especially the ones that are in modern-day Latin America, places like Peru, are very rich in silver, and so silver mining becomes a major part of the Spanish economy. And then finally, glory refers to the idea of glorifying Spain, making the country, making the monarchs richer and more kind of globally powerful. Moving down one, France's reasons and goals for settlement have a lot in common with New Spain. They're also looking to spread Catholicism. They're also looking to enrich and strengthen the French state and monarchy. Their chief economic element, however, it's not mining, but it's fur trading, especially the fur of the North American beaver as a very valuable commodity that Europeans like to make into hats and other outerwear because it's water repellent. One more down, like the French, the Dutch are also looking to make money in the fur trade, but there's some really significant differences from either New Spain or New France. And the biggest is that New Netherlands is not a royal or a government colony. Instead, it's founded as a business to make money for a group of investors, not for a monarch. It's through a brand new type of business entity at the time called a joint stock corporation, which you can see in bold down there. The company was called the Dutch West India Company, and the colony that they founded was the city, what is today New York City. It was called New Amsterdam. And then they had plantations, basically patroonships up the river. Finally, in the last row, the English or British, their colonies, unlike the Spanish, French, the British were founded by diverse groups. They don't have just like one centralized origin story or reason under the crown. Instead, you have like Jamestown, Virginia, founded as a joint stock company for profit, like the New Netherlands. You have Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, founded as religious refuges. You have Pennsylvania and like New York, once we take it from the Dutch, that are established as proprietary colonies gifted by the king to specific people. Eventually, all of the British colonies will technically become royal colonies by the early 1700s, but their variety of like founding methods ensured that they developed pretty separately and independently from each other and from the British crown to a much greater degree than any other empire. Another really major difference with the British is that the British, in comparison to all of the other empires on the chart, are by far the most interested in settling and living on the land. Their primary economic engine is agricultural, not mining, not furs, right? If you look over at the very last row of the chart, where it says population, you can see that the British colonies have like by far the biggest settlement population of colonists. It's not necessarily the biggest population. New Spain has a very large indigenous population, for example, that's not represented in these numbers, but definitely by far the biggest colonial population. All of these are settler colonial projects, right? But the British in particular are really, they're bringing whole families. They're establishing like numerous pretty large communities. That's why the British win the French and Indian War. It's also one part of why the British government loses the revolution. There's a lot of us. The last big point of difference amongst these colonial empires is relationship with Native Americans. Comes up pretty frequently. I see a lot of multiple choice questions in particular that sort of depend on you understanding the kind of like broad strokes of difference among the empires. Basically, the Spanish are most interested in natives as labor. So they want to like pacify them, bring them within the colonial system and like the church so that they can use them as labor. The French are also interested in conversion, but their primary economic like use for natives is as trading partners. They want them to go into the interior, get all of those valuable furs. And so the French tend to maintain more like diplomatic or trade-based relations with native tribes. The Dutch are similar to the French without the conversion motive largely. And then the British, on the other hand, as we've just said, they're more interested in settling. They're interested in land ownership. So they don't tend to want like labor from Native Americans. We do enslave some natives and send them to like the Caribbean, for example, but that was primarily a method of, wasn't like the goal was slavery. The goal was to get natives off their land, right? Whether it was through treaty, through war and violence, right? Whatever it takes to claim as much like possession of the land as possible. That was what the British wanted to do. They're not really interested in converting Native Americans. There are some exceptions here, like you might potentially remember learning about the praying towns that some Puritan communities founded to try to convert Native Americans, but it wasn't widespread. It's not really characteristic of the British Empire overall. Okay, so this is a good place to pause and check out this chart if you have not gotten a chance to yet. Next up, we're going to check out the like regions of the British colonies. So within the British Empire, you need to know a little bit about each of the geographical regions. It's another major area you could be asked to compare. You need to know these 4 regions of the British colonies. They're all listed in that like left column there. They're in order from north to south. We talked about them in class in the order they were founded. This is geographic. Not on here, but also like should be kind of mentally added. Remember that the British had colonies in the West Indies as well. This is like Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, several other islands. On these islands, they grew sugar using a large enslaved African population. We don't tend to talk about them as much in this class because, of course, they don't eventually become part of the United States, but to the British crown, they were like by far the most valuable part of their like American colonial empire. So with these 4 regions, first you need to have a sense of like which colonies fall in which regions. This is a very common mistake that students make. See it especially in the SAQs and LEQs, also in the multiple choice sometimes, is like they get a question that asks about the economy in New England, and then they write about like Virginia and tobacco. So that's like a correct fact, Virginia and tobacco, but if it's in the wrong region, it's wrong. You're not going to get the points. So for each of these regions, you definitely want to know like 1 or 2 key colonies. And in New England, which is like yellow on the map, that is Massachusetts, which was originally 2 separate colonies, Plymouth on the hook, founded first by separatists, and then Massachusetts Bay, founded by non-separatists. They merge in the 1680s into the colony of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is most central, then you get Connecticut and Rhode Island, and remember that those are founded by Puritan, the term is dissidents, or sometimes dissenters, who get kicked out or sometimes flee Massachusetts. Connecticut is founded by a man named Thomas Hooker, who's a Puritan minister who thinks that non-church members should be able to vote. Rhode Island is formed by Roger Williams, who is a Puritan minister who disagrees on several points with the Puritan ministers in Massachusetts Bay, including their treatment of Native Americans. The term that I just used, that dissidents or dissenter term, you'll see sometimes too, those are words that refer to any person or any group that are like disagreeing or going against the state religion, so the like established religion of the state. This can get kind of confusing for students sometimes, because back home in England, the Puritans are dissenters. They're a dissenting religion against the Church of England. But once they get here, now they are the state religion, right? You have to be a member of the Puritan Church to like vote in Massachusetts. So now people going against the Puritans, Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson is another very famous dissenter who winds up getting exiled from the colony. They're dissenting against the Puritan church now, right? So again, that can kind of confuse people sometimes. Rhode Island, remember, is famously called the sewer by Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop because of his perception that all of the dissenting like trash from Massachusetts Bay went there. Okay. Some more details about New England. Economically, New England is mostly small farms, especially like the further inland you go in Massachusetts. These are often called yeoman farms. Y-E-O-M-A-N is how you spell that word. Just means they're owned and worked by a single family. They're not like a large plantation. The other economic engine in New England is maritime trades. Maritime means having to do with the sea. So shipbuilding, fishing, sailing, participating in the slave trade, right, included in that, whaling, hunting whales for whale oil, among other things. New England also has what was for a very long time the biggest city in the colonies, which is Boston, and there's a lot of trade and commerce happening there. So New England is like a little bit of a mixed economy, but mostly based on small farming is usually how you'll see that represented. Other specific things you may want to know about New England. Again, we're talking in comparison to other colonial regions. It's founded in 1620 by Puritans, as we mentioned earlier, and Puritan settlers tended to come in like entire family groups. It would be like a father, a mother, their children, and their servants, their whole household. Sometimes entire village congregations would like pick up from England and immigrate together. This is a much different settlement pattern than we'll see in, say, the Chesapeake, and it results in a lot of like small villages with a very tightly surveilled social community. Everybody knows each other. Again, everybody's intended to be part of the church. If you look at the bottom right of this slide, you'll see a map of an early New England village. It shows that all of the homes are clustered together around a central church or meeting house with fields around the edge of the town. If you get a document like this, usually the questions want you to recognize the symbolism of the church and like communal grazing lands being literally in the center of the town. The closer that you are to the time period of settlement in the 1620s, the more rigidly the Puritan church controlled like village society and the government of the colony. The later that you go in time, the more that influence of the Puritan church kind of falls off. If you get a question about New England in the like 1600s, you can talk about the Puritans. If you get a question about New England in the 1700s, like the year starts with 17, you can talk about the legacy of the Puritans as influential, but the Puritan church itself is like mostly gone by then. It's transitioned into what we call the Congregational church. A key document from those early years, the early 1600s, is a sermon from Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop. He gave it on board the ship Arabella, like while they were immigrating. It's called a model of Christian charity, but it's usually like by its nickname, which is the City on a Hill speech. So you can always call it that in like if you're using it as evidence. In the speech, Winthrop encourages his fellow settlers to see themselves as like God's uniquely chosen people, destined to found a community that will be like a shining model of Christianity for all of the world to emulate. This is often described as the first expression of something called American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is like a rhetorical device, a philosophical belief that stated that Americans are in some way like inherently or uniquely superior to other people. In the early usages of American exceptionalism, like here with the City on a Hill sermon, it's almost always religious, okay? God loves us best, right? We're God's chosen people. As American history goes forward, though, it tends to become less religious and more secular nationalism. Like, Americans are awesome because, like, our unique American history makes us, like, better than everybody else. You can connect American exceptionalism to, like, later ideals like Manifest Destiny or the American Dream or, like, Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis. Next up, for early colonial New England, you need to understand that they have a distinct type of government that's usually called town meetings, dating all the way back to the original Mayflower Compact Agreement. All adult men who were church members could vote on local politics and eventually elect representatives at the colony level. This meant that a lot of decisions could happen at the local level instead of being decided by like a royal governor, right? And this gives New England a long history of more direct democracy than some other like colonial regions. It's one reason why independence movements tend to start in this region. Not the only reason, but one. Last thing for New England, for each of the colonial regions, you want to know like a tribe or two in the area. There's often questions about interactions between settlers and natives. It's good to be able to drop a specific tribe if you can. In New England, the Wampanoag are who lived closest to a lot of the early colonial settlements. That's a Wampanoag, Wampanoag. And their biggest rivals are tribes called the Pequot and the Narragansett. So that's sort of who you'll see mostly up in the New England area. As in most regions, we start out with some sort of like tentative cooperation between settlers and local tribes, attempts to kind of like feel each other out. This is where we get the famous story of the first Thanksgiving feast in Plymouth. The story is like grossly mythologized, but it is a historical fact that this feast occurred with like Puritans and Wampanoag. But of course, our relations quickly escalate to conflict, first with Pequot War in the 1630s. And then eventually there's one specific conflict that you need to know by name that's called out in the course and exam description specifically. And that is like Metacom War or King Philip's War. This is so important it gets its own slide. So it starts in 1675, but it's mostly going on during 1676. That is about 50 years after Puritan settlement in New England and exactly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. So kind of like the middle of the colonial era. A man named Metacom, who was known as King Philip to the English, he was a Wampanoag leader. He had kind of rallied the remnants of a bunch of the other New England tribes that have kind of like survived up to this point, Wampanoag, Narragansett, Pequot, Nipmuc, right, to unite and launch attacks on the English settlements. They're trying to stop expansion of like Massachusetts, the Plymouth colonies. A lot of this is going on in Connecticut, which was where a lot of the expansion was happening at the time. This is one of the bloodiest conflicts in all of American history relative to the population. So if you look at like the number of people killed compared to the number of people who were living there, it's incredibly deadly. It destroys many New England towns. It goes on for, like I said, like a year and a half. And the colonies fight this like almost entirely without any help from England. So this kind of fosters a distinct like regional identity, like a New England independence identity, and arguably kind of like an American identity in a way that we will talk about when we eventually get to the French and Indian War as well. Ultimately, King Philip's defeat, it solidifies colonial dominance in the area. It basically ends colonial resistance, or excuse me, native resistance in colonial New England. Okay, so that's New England. Next up, we're sort of heading south from New England, and we find the middle colonies. The two key colonies you need to know about here are New York and Pennsylvania. Delaware and New Jersey are the other two. They're less significant at the test level. Both of these, both New York and Pennsylvania, are founded as proprietary colonies. That is when the king, in this case the newly restored Charles II, gave a colonial land grant to like a supporter or a friend to completely control. So like giving a gift of an entire colony. Pennsylvania was given to William Penn, who was a wealthy man who sort of, I always think of William Penn as like Quaker curious. He wasn't a Quaker himself, but he really admired their beliefs. The Quakers, also dissenters against the Church of England, they believed that all human beings were equal before God and therefore like equally able to sort of hear his still small voice within them and kind of speak to that experience. This means that the Quakers tend to reject like hierarchies that place like some people above others. The Quakers eventually become leading drivers of like anti-slavery movements in the United States as a result of these beliefs. So Penn envisions like a whole society built from the ground up on like Quaker principles. He calls it his holy experiment, right? That's a term that's specifically associated with Pennsylvania. Maybe unfortunately for this vision, he offers like really generous land policies. It allows basically anybody to immigrate, like not just Quakers, and especially to buy land. So this leads to a pretty diverse population in Pennsylvania, like more about that in a minute, and kind of waters down or undermines the Quaker influence within, you know, the first generation of settlement. New York, meanwhile, was gifted to the king's brother James, the Duke of York. However, the land that he gifted was not unclaimed by either natives or by other Europeans. It was the New Netherlands. So the Duke of York sends ships to take the Dutch colony by force. When they arrive, the city of New Amsterdam, which is like really outgunned, just surrenders basically, and the colony becomes New York non-violently, essentially, with a lot of the Dutch settlers and the Africans that they enslaved choose to stay. Both New York City and the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania become significant urban centers. Philadelphia eventually becomes the biggest city in the colonies by the time of the Revolution. These two cities have lots of trade, shipping, commerce, like Boston did, but the rest of the colonies, like the rest of New York and Philadelphia, New Jersey, etc., really fertile growing land, perfect for growing what we call sometimes bread basket crops. You'll also see them called cereal crops. These are grains, right, like corn, wheat, barley, etc. So this means that middle colonies develop a very mixed economy, right, farming and agriculture and commerce and trade. The most significant cultural element in the middle colonies is that ethnic and religious diversity that I was just mentioning. Here's actually like a specific call out slide. Because of Pennsylvania's really liberal land policies and then New York's Dutch origins, we get a lot of settlers from other parts of Europe in the middle colonies, especially people coming from the Germanic states. There's no single Germany yet, but sort of like what's going to become Germany. There's no new Germany. So if you lived in like, Prussia or Brandenburg and you wanted to immigrate to the Americas, this was often your option. They settle in ethnic communities. They maintain a lot of their language and culture. Future President Martin Van Buren, he was born in upstate New York in 1782, which is like the end of the Revolutionary War, right? So a long time after New York becomes British. But he grew up speaking Dutch. Like that was his childhood language. That's how long that language and that culture lingered. There's a graphic, this map on the slide that we saw in our notes in class. It's a really good one to revisit. If you want, you can kind of pause here and take a look at it. It lays out like the patterns of ethnic settlement in the colonies, and it's useful for sort of thinking about kind of who is moving where. Okay, so that's the middle colonies. Next up, keep going southward, and we hit the Chesapeake. This is like the upper South, right? We talked about these first in class because, of course, they're settled first, beginning at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. The other Chesapeake colony is Maryland. That was founded as a proprietary colony a little bit later. The king gave it to a Catholic lord, Lord Baltimore, and he used it as a refuge for his sort of fellow Catholic landowners in the kind of religious wars of the 1600s. Key things about the Chesapeake. First, and extremely likely to come up if you get a question on this, is that Virginia is founded for economic motives, right? It's founded by a joint stock company, as we touched on earlier. These are early corporations. They have charter from the king, permission to exist from the king, but it's like a private corporation. Its purpose is to make money for its stockholders. This charter, the one that's issued to the Jamestown Company, and then all the ones for later colonies, one really important thing to understand about those charters is that they, like the words in them guaranteed that anyone who settled in Virginia, right, was guaranteed the same rights of Englishmen as they would have had if they stayed. This is important, this language in the charter. It's going to become a major basis of rhetoric during the Road to the Revolution period, where colonial leaders are arguing that they're being denied this right that's written into their charter. They're not being, treated like Englishmen. The economic motive for settlement also impacts settlement patterns. Virginia, unlike New England that we were just talking about, it's not settled by families, not at first, but it's instead settled largely by single men. If you remember in class, we talked a bit about the primogeniture inheritance and the problem of landless younger sons who had to seek out their own fortune. That's a big part of the early migrants to the Jamestown area. The early years of the Virginia colony are really tough. Sometimes they're called the starving time. We talked a little bit about the fact that there's evidence of cannibalism from the winter of, I think, 1609. I believe that's the correct year. What eventually turns the colony profitable a couple of years in is when a sweeter strain of the tobacco is native to the Americas, but it's not the nice stuff. So John Rolfe in 1612 introduces a sweeter, more smokable strain basically of tobacco, and tobacco growth becomes the center of Virginia's economy. Leads the colony to spread out, not in the sort of more centralized villages like we talked about in New England, but instead to spread out in plantations, sort of far apart, small population plantations. This leads to a much more rural society, much more agricultural, cash crop driven economy. Of course, tobacco production also creates a perceived need for cheap and easily controlled labor source because tobacco is very labor intensive. This is going to fuel the development of two different exploited labor systems over the course of the 1600s. First, we have indentured servitude. This is where European migrants, usually from places like Ireland or Wales, where there was a lot of poverty, they contracted for a period of time, somewhere in the 4 to 7 year range, to work in the American colonies. And in exchange, what they got was usually passage over to the colonies, room and board, so like you're not paying rent or anything like that. Sometimes prisoners were also sentenced to indentured servitude, but mostly people were signing up for this on their own. And what they were doing was they were selling their labor, not their actual like personal freedom. But while they were under indenture, they were treated a lot like the way that we understand slavery today. Their indenture could be bought and sold without their consent, so they could be sort of sold from person to person. They weren't allowed to marry. They often couldn't testify in court, right? They were treated very poorly without, not much legal recourse. At the end of their indenture, if they survived, they would receive what were called freedom dues. This is usually a small amount of land or tools or clothes or something like that. All of the colonies had indentured servants, like this labor system existed everywhere, but Virginia actively encouraged its colonists to recruit them. It had a policy called the head right system, where each colonist who paid for someone's passage to come over would receive 50 acres of land. It's a lot of land. So that as long as the death rate is high and a lot of your indentured servants won't live until you have to pay out the freedom dues, this was a pretty profitable form of labor for Virginia landowners. The other labor system, of course, which develops kind of in parallel with indentured servitude, but like more slowly, in the British North American colonies at least, was race-based chattel slavery. We are going to talk about that and about Bacon's Rebellion more fully on their own slides in just a minute, as they're very important, but I want to finish the regional comparison first. So other things you should know about the Chesapeake: the House of Burgesses, begun in 1619, is our first British North American example of representative government. Not direct democracy like we saw in New England with the Mayflower Compact and the town meetings, but representative democracy where voters, that's like landowning males in Virginia, elected someone to represent their interests in the colonial legislature. The House of Burgesses eventually developed the ability to start or initiate legislation without Parliament. So again, like a seed of independence that is part of the basis of revolutionary ideals. Primary group of Native Americans in the Jamestown area are the Powhatan, and they're a great example, just like the Pequot that we talked about a little bit ago, of how early colonist-native relations are complex and shifting, combining trade, conflict, right, before developing into war and land dispossession. All right, so our last region, the South. So what we were just talking about, the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland, that's also part of what I would call the South today, but the College Board subdivides the colonial South into two regions. The Chesapeake's like the upper South and sort of develops out of Jamestown and Virginia. And then the Southern colonies and their sort of main base of origin is Charleston, South Carolina. So that's sort of where we're hanging out in the early colonial period. Charleston, founded as just Carolina before it splits into North and South, this was another proprietary colony, not given to one person in this case, but given to a group of 8 people, usually called the Lords Proprietors. Most of them held significant plantations already in the West Indies, places like, Barbados, right? And they were mostly interested in developing Charleston as like a trading post for the West Indies. So of all of the 13 colonies, this is the one, South Carolina, is the one that has the most direct connection to the West Indies sugar trade. Like the Chesapeake, Charleston also develops plantation-style agriculture, but we're a bit too far south in Charleston for tobacco to grow well, so the chief cash crop there is rice, eventually joined by indigo. Remember, cotton is not a major cash crop until the invention of the cotton gin after the American Revolution. Very common mistake that students make. So rice and indigo in the colonial period. Charleston's the biggest port city in the South. It eventually grows into one of the biggest slave ports in the world and certainly in North America. And the Charleston planters discover that enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa have a considerable skill and knowledge in growing rice specifically. Unlike in Virginia, where race-based chattel slavery develops really slowly over the decades, early Charleston settlers in the 1680s pretty much just import their slave code, the institution of slavery, directly from the Sugar Islands. So there's not a period of development of slave codes so much. South Carolina, at the time of the Revolution, a majority of the population is enslaved. So again, it's a colony that's very dominated by this particular labor system. South Carolina is the most valuable of the 13 North American colonies in the sense that it produces the most for Great Britain. And one reason why that's a concern for the British Crown is that South Carolina was vulnerable because it was, from its founding, the closest to Spanish Florida. Spain and Britain had been at war off and on for most of the colonial period, so this is bad. The Spanish had outlawed slavery in their colony of Florida, only there, not their other colonies. And one likely reason is that it encouraged enslaved people in South Carolina to try to run away to Florida. Around the time of the Stono Rebellion, which is the biggest slave rebellion in the 13 colonies, the British King George decided to create Georgia as a proprietary colony, the very last of the colonies. You can see the date on there, founded in the 1733. As two things. It's intended to provide a buffer between South Carolina and Florida, and he also wanted to give a social reformer by the name of James Oglethorpe a chance to try out his idea of making Georgia a colony for people in debtor's prison to work off their debts and become small farmers. Despite Oglethorpe's vision of the Georgia colony as like a free white yeoman utopia, Georgia very quickly becomes kind of like just South Carolina Part 2 in terms of its economy and the reliance on plantation slavery. It's worth noting here very briefly that the southern colonies are going to generally end up being the most loyalist when we get to the American Revolution in the next historical period. This is where we're going to see a big concentration of loyalists, and Georgia in particular is the colony that's like the least likely to be participating in a lot of the Road to the Revolution stuff. If you remember, they don't even send delegates to the First Continental Congress, and a big part of that is because they are very recent, right? They've only been a colony for like 40 years at that point. So that's all of the colonial regions compared. This slide here has the full chart that we just worked through. This is a great place to pause and maybe screenshot if you want to see it all together. In addition to comparing colonial regions, there's some things that you do need to know that are in common to all of them, so across all the 13 colonies. I've already mentioned that both indentured servitude and eventually slavery are present in all of the 13 colonies. New England, Middle Colonies, Chesapeake, South, all of them have slavery and indentured servitude. Some colonies like Georgia or Rhode Island start out outlawing slavery, but they eventually legalize it, again, by the time of the Revolution. More on that in a minute. Next, while all the colonies start out with different kinds of charters, joint stock charters, proprietary charters, they all wind up with royal charters by 1700. So this means that they all are like technically under the control of the monarch. They all have royal governors appointed by the king. Most of those governors are going to appoint their own governor's council made up of like wealthy colonists for the most part. And all of the colonies are also going to have some version of colonial assembly, like a legislature that makes laws. And you can see that they have like different names and different organizations. Most are bicameral. In all colonies, you had to be white, male, and 21 to vote. And in most, you had to be a landowner. You had to be wealthy as well. Only Rhode Island had what we call universal male suffrage. You didn't have to be wealthy there, just white, male, and 21 to vote. Other things that all of the colonies have in common that we're going to be talking about in the next couple slides here is that they're all influenced by what the College Board will often refer to as transatlantic exchanges. This is a good phrase to be familiar with. It just means that the colonies are influenced by ideas or movements coming across the Atlantic from Europe. The two best examples of this are the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. Talk more in a sec. There's also what's called a print culture coming across the Atlantic, meaning we're getting like newspapers and magazines, right? Printed items from Great Britain. We're buying British goods. We're sending our rich colonial children to school in Great Britain, right? There's a lot of exchanges across the Atlantic, and as a result, the College Board will sometimes argue that the colonies become increasingly anglicized. You'll see that word right down there at the very bottom. That is, that they all develop institutions and cultures that are closely connected to Great Britain. So even a colony like New York that started out Dutch is fairly anglicized institutionally. They're using British common law. They have a royal governor by the time of the Revolution, even though the Dutch cultural legacy remains. So basically all of like the major nouns on this slide we're going to go talk about in a little bit more detail. First, slavery. So the transatlantic slave trade is about as old as exploration. It's Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. The transatlantic slave trade also starts in the 1490s as the Portuguese established trading ports that eventually became slave trading ports in West Africa. Originally, the slave trade was dominated by the Portuguese and Spanish. It's at its height in the 18th century. So if you look at the graph at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that it's measuring kind of like the volume of the slave trade across the centuries, and it sort of peaks in like the late 1700s and very early 1800s, right around the time of the American Revolution. By that point in the slave trade, the Spanish and the Portuguese have kind of fallen off a little bit, and it's dominated by like Dutch and British ships, American ships as well, although obviously other countries continue to participate. So from the 1500s all the way through the 1800s, we have this trade pattern that you can see on the map on the top of the slide here, commonly referred to as the triangle trade, where ships from Europe loaded with guns and finished goods sail to Africa, where they take on cargoes of kidnapped and enslaved West Africans, and then sail along what becomes known as the Middle Passage, the route from Africa to the Americas, where they will sell their human cargo in the West Indies, in Brazil, in Charleston, right, and then take on raw goods like rice or tobacco or sugar to bring back to Europe and start the cycle over again. You might recall me saying that it's very common for the institution of slavery to show up in CCOT, or continuity and change over time questions, because it exists for so long and it's such a central part of the American story. This slide here tries to sum up some of those continuities. Continuities are things that stay the same and changes across the kind of centuries that we've covered so far in historical period 1 and 2. You'll see expanded versions of this slide containing new information as we go through the next few historical periods. So here we have the 1500s and the 1600s. That's the 16th and 17th century. As far as some major things to know about the institution of slavery in this era, note that we have like a steady stream of newly enslaved people who were born in Africa to the colonies. They are living alongside people who were enslaved or born in the Caribbean, maybe people speaking like French or Dutch, Spanish as a language of origin, who were then sold to the 13 colonies. And increasingly, they are also enslaved alongside like African Americans, right? Black people born here in the English colonies, sometimes, generations deep, certainly by the time that we get to the late 1600s. This blending of people of different backgrounds and like languages is what creates what we call the African American culture in the United States. It's going to be really significant kind of culturally when we stop seeing that influx of people directly from Africa, when we outlaw the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. Other things that are on here that I want to highlight, we've already talked about this idea that race-based chattel slavery really develops as an institution over time. Early in the 1600s, most colonies did not have slave codes. So like early Jamestown, no slave codes. Early like Plymouth, no slave codes. And many of the Black people who were there were relatively few of them, and they tended to be treated legally more as like indentured servants. They could maybe become free, they could eventually own land, or maybe they could like earn their freedom by converting to Christianity and then like suing for freedom. Starting in the kind of like mid 1600s, like 1630s, 1640s, we'll see the institution start to harden through the passage of laws called slave codes, which for example, codify the idea of like slave status descends from the mother. Slave status means that you're a servant for life, that you can't be free eventually, cuts off other opportunities to earn freedom, those types of things. The turning point in the Chesapeake specifically, when we go from like, okay, most laborers are like white indentured servants to most laborers are enslaved Black people, is something called Bacon's Rebellion. This is actually a rebellion that doesn't have anything to do with slavery on the surface. This is not like a slave rebellion or slave revolt, but it has a tremendous impact on the institution, so we are going to give it its own slide. Bacon's Rebellion is 1676, the same year as Metacom's War that we talked about in New England, but down in Virginia. We're 100 years away from the Declaration of Independence. This is basically a class rebellion. This is like a rich versus poor thing. You have poor indentured servants, landless whites. They're angry at the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley, because they thought he was giving Native Americans like favorable trade deals and ignoring Native attacks on frontier settlements. He was trying to like uphold an agreement that he had made with Native Americans not to let the colonists continue to expand west. These people, the rebels, are disenfranchised. They can't vote because they don't have land. They can't buy land because Berkeley is restricting westward settlement. They can't get married, right? So lots of things wrong with their lives. So led by Nathaniel Bacon, the guy on the slide, there is a mob, an army, a militia, right? You can use a bunch of different words of like poor whites, freed servants, enslaved people, marching eastward from like the western edge of Virginia settlement towards the coast where the elite planters lived. They want to burn down Jamestown. Bacon's militia forced Governor Berkeley from Jamestown. He like flees the city. They burn the capital, but the rebellion collapses after Bacon dies of disease. I think cholera, if I'm not mistaken. Following the rebellion, the plantation elites feared the like instability of white indentured servants, basically because they become free. They're not like a permanently controlled working class and they could like riot and come kill us. So whether consciously or unconsciously, those planter elites increasingly shift from purchasing indentured servant labor to enslaving Africans to avoid creating this sort of like volatile class of former servants, basically. So again, Bacon's Rebellion, it's not a slave rebellion, but it is a rebellion that leads to changes in the institution of slavery. So it's a really key like turning point term for this historical period broadly. Moving on to other things that impact all of the colonies, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is an 18th century intellectual and philosophical movement. It emphasizes reason, like scientific logic, individualism, skepticism of traditional authority, like monarchies or established churches, looking for evidence, right, to prove commonly accepted beliefs. It's often called the Age of Reason for that reason. The movement originates in Europe, but heavily influences the American colonies. The ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who coined the term natural rights, right, to argue that all individuals are born with inherent rights, life, liberty, and property, in his words, that no government can take away. One thing that you need to be careful of, like a quite common error, is John Locke is not a founding father himself. He died in 1704, like 70 years before the American Revolution. He never visited the colonies. His ideas influenced our founding fathers, like Jefferson, but he was not a founding father himself, so just be careful about that. The Enlightenment is a really great example of something that we talked about earlier, which is that transatlantic print culture. It greatly influences colonial and revolutionary thought. Many, or like I guess I would say even most of our founding fathers are very heavily influenced in particular by the Enlightenment. Lots of them are deists. That was a Enlightenment-ish religious philosophy that viewed God as like a watchmaker or a clockmaker who kind of like created the universe, but then stands back and just lets it tick away, doesn't intervene in its daily operation. Ben Franklin's probably a really good example of an American thinker who's very like embodies the Enlightenment. In the midst of the Enlightenment in the 1730s and 40s, another transatlantic exchange brings the First Great Awakening to the colonies. This was a fervent, like emotional Protestant revival movement. It was reacting against declining like religiosity or piety and the kind of like intellectual like removal of the Enlightenment. Like, people who were into the First Great Awakening did not like deism, right? They saw that as sort of cold and detached. The First Great Awakening emphasizes personal salvation, like you as an individual and your individual relationship with God. It challenges traditional church authority. It's mostly spread by, the College Board uses the word itinerant ministers. That means they're traveling. They don't have like a home church. Examples include Jonathan Edwards, known for the sermon, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God, and man is destined to hell as sparks fly upward, and you're all loathsome insects," right? And the other big name is George Whitefield or Whitfield. Whitfield is British. He comes across the Atlantic on a ship and starts preaching here, kind of spreading the Great Awakening. So a literal example of a transatlantic exchange in that case. He draws huge crowds, big passionate open air preaching. This movement is the first to actively target like enslaved Black communities for conversion to Christianity. So you have Black Christians in the Americas before this, but this is really when like the Black church as an institution starts to form. Big significance of the First Great Awakening is that it kind of unites colonies across the region, at least in some sort of small cultural way through like a shared evangelical fervor. It also encourages kind of like an anti-authoritarian mindset that will kind of be contributing factors to the revolution, which is just a couple decades away at this point. One thing to be really careful of, common wrong answer choice if you get a question about the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening in the like 1820s, 1830s, that will lead to major social reform movements, abolition, temperance, right? This one doesn't have much of a social reform component. It's much more focused on spiritual or religious reform. Okay, last topic for this particular historical period has to do with the relationship between Great Britain and her colonies. That is something that will change a lot next historical period, so we're CCOTing here, right, between historical periods 2 and 3. One good thing to keep in mind is that, like, from the start, the other colonial empires, New Spain in particular, they're very centralized, right? They are under the direct control of the monarch. They don't govern themselves. They're not autonomous, but that's not really true of the British colonies. They've never been fully centralized. They're founded as a set of separate colonies. They have different founders. They have different goals. And the British Crown has like tried at various points to take more control over the colonies. Like they really do want what Spain has, but it's generally not going to work. So we'll sort of talk about their tries and then evidence that it doesn't work. Some of the big terms on this slide that sort of govern the early relationship between Britain and the colonies. One of the main goal of all of the colonial empires in this time period, and certainly the British, is what's usually referred to as mercantilism or mercantilism, if you prefer. This is the economic theory that colonies only exist to enrich the mother country through what's called a favorable balance of trade. That means that the mother country gets to export or sell more than they import or buy, thereby accumulating like actual cash money or what they call bullion, gold usually. In your national treasury, you can dominate your peer countries, right? Life is good. So as a result of this theory, it's like colonies solely exist to be an economic benefit to the mother country. That's it. That's their whole purpose. So what this leads to in the British Empire is a sense among not every single British monarch, but a lot of them, that it's kind of like not that big of a deal if the colonies are a little more autonomous or if they're governing themselves, as long as they're still bringing in money. So So the British government will sort of swing back and forth between like trying to bring the colonies under some more control and then just being like, well, whatever, we're still getting money. An example of the more control, it's trying to enforce mercantilism. Starting in the 1650s, the British Parliament passes a series of laws called the Navigation Act. So Navigation Act of 1650, Navigation Act of 1682, right? They're all different years, but they all do basically the same thing. They require that all colonial trade needs to go through British ships and or British ports to like restrict colonial economic independence. So if you were a colonist and you wanted to buy rum from the French colony of like Saint-Domingue, which is Haiti today, you couldn't just have your rum come on a ship directly from Saint-Domingue to Charleston. It had to go from Saint-Domingue all the way to England, get taxed in England, and then come back to Charleston on a British ship. So big increase in like time and money for you, the colonist. So for many years, the British were not, like I said, very good at strictly enforcing these laws. This allows the colonies to develop their own economies. They engage in a lot of independent trade. They are often bypassing British restrictions through smuggling, illegally bringing goods in without paying taxes. And most colonists don't really see anything wrong with this. They just kind of look the other way. This unspoken policy of like ignoring colonial independence is known as salutary neglect. Salutary means like healthful or not bad for you. Lastly, a very good thing to be aware of that will set you apart from other students taking the AP exam is to know that even before the French and Indian War, there are examples of colonial resistance to the British colonies. It's not like we are these perfectly happy, like loyal colonists, and then along comes the French and Indian War and like taxes and like a switch flips and all of a sudden we're independent. In fact, there's several examples, a lot more than are on this slide even, of colonists, American colonists resisting early British attempts to like bring them under more control. So you could view Bacon's Rebellion that we just talked about as part of this pattern. It's a rebellion against the policies of a British appointed governor, right? So that's an example. But probably the best example is what happens with what's called the Dominion of New England. So the King of England in the 1680s, James II, he wants to have more centralized control. He's one of those monarchs who's like, needs to, we want to get a handle on this. So he revokes all of the charters of all the New England colonies, like Massachusetts, New England, Connecticut, New Hampshire, right, et cetera, and then also New York. And he makes them into one big, like, centralized colony called the Dominion of New England. Colonists hate this. The colony of Connecticut famously like hides its colonial charter in a tree rather than give it up. They hate the royal governor that he appoints as a man named Edmund Andros. And in about a year and a half, when James is overthrown in the Glorious Revolution back in Britain, colonists happily have their own little revolution, overthrow Andros. He gets back on a ship and is sort of chased out of the colonies, and they immediately return to their original charter status under the new King and Queen William and Mary. Smuggling that we just talked about, that's another great example of resistance to British policies, right, avoiding the Navigation Acts. And the very last thing down here at the bottom, which comes directly from a key concept, this states that the colonies are developing what they call autonomous institutions. Autonomous is like self-governing or self-directed. They are basically operating without any intervention from the British themselves. They're anglicized, like they look British. They use British common law. They have very similar court systems, but they're not exact copies, and they're not dependent on the British to make decisions. Good evidence for this is the trial of a man named John Peter Zenger. He's a newspaper editor. He was being tried for libel for saying very mean things in his newspaper about the governor of New York at the time. And the courts in New York, in the colony of New York, basically decide that it's not libel if it's true. That is not a decision that had precedent in British common law. Like Zenger almost certainly would have been found guilty if he was tried in Britain. So Zenger's trial is sometimes cited by historians as an early example of like freedom of the press, of course, but more directly an early example of how American institutions like the New York colonial courts, even though they look British, they are to some extent at least operating autonomously. So this takes us up to the end of historical period 2, which remember ends right as the French and Indian War starts in 1754. French and Indian War is the start of the road to the revolution, and that's where we'll pick up in the next video. Thank you all for your time. Bye y'all.